I'm freezing. Human, let me in. The voice didn't shout, didn't beg, didn't tremble the way a dying person should. And that was the first thing Elias Crow noticed as he stood motionless inside his cabin. The fire behind him burning low and steady, casting long shadows across the rough pine walls while the storm outside clawed at the door like something alive. Wind howling across the plains with a force that could strip bark from trees and drive a man to his knees in under 10 minutes. The kind of cold that settled into bone and stayed there, waiting, patient, unforgiving, and still. That voice came again, softer this time, as if it already knew he had heard it the first time. I'm freezing. Elias didn't move, not yet, his hand resting near the old revolver on the table, not gripping it, not reaching, just close enough to remind himself that out here, 30 miles from the nearest town and farther still from anything resembling help, kindness was a decision a man paid for, one way or another, and most men learned to stop paying after a while, learned to let the wind take what it wanted and keep their doors shut, their fires small, their lives quiet. But Elias Crow had never quite managed that. Not completely. Not even after 7 years of silence and dust, and the kind of loneliness that settled heavier than winter snow. And so he stepped closer to the door, each footfall slow against the wooden floor, boots worn thin at the edges, breath steady but shallow, listening. Because there was something else beneath the storm now, something quieter, something that didn't belong to the wind or the shifting timbers of the house. A presence that waited rather than pushed, and when he finally reached the door, he didn't open it right away. Instead, he leaned slightly, just enough to catch the faintest outline through the narrow crack between frame and wood, a shape pressed close to the storm, small, still, and for a moment he thought it might already be too late, that whatever had spoken those words was nothing more than a body left behind by the cold. But then it moved, just barely, and the storm carried a faint exhale against the wood, and Elias felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, not yet, something older than that, something quieter, the kind of instinct a man learns to ignore until he can't. And then the voice came a third time, closer now, almost against the door itself. Let me in. There was no urgency in it, no edge, just a statement, like a fact already decided. And that was the second thing Elias noticed, because out here, people who asked for help always carried something with them. Fear, desperation, anger, something. But this voice carried none of it, and that made his hand finally move, not to the gun, but to the latch, fingers rough against the cold iron as he paused one last time, listening for anything beyond the storm, any sign of more than one set of footsteps, any hint that opening this door meant inviting something he couldn't send away. But the plains offered nothing back except wind and distance. And so he lifted the latch and pulled the door open just enough to see her, standing there in the storm like she had been carved out of it, a young Apache woman, her dark hair stiff with ice at the edges, her clothes worn thin and dusted with snow. But her eyes were clear, steady, not pleading, not afraid, and they met his the moment the door moved, as if she had been waiting for that exact second. And for a long breath neither of them spoke, the storm rushing past her into the cabin, carrying the sharp scent of frozen earth and distant pine. And Elias realized then that she wasn't collapsing, wasn't swaying the way someone on the edge should. She was standing, balanced, watching him the same way he was watching her. And then she said it again, quieter now, almost a whisper. I told you. I'll reward you. The words settled between them, strange and out of place in the middle of that storm. And Elias felt something shift, not outside, not in the wind or the sky, but inside the moment itself, like the ground had tilted just enough to change the way everything stood, and without fully understanding why, without asking another question or waiting for one more answer, he stepped back and opened the door wider, letting the storm in for a second longer before closing it behind her, the wood thudding softly into place, sealing the cold outside while something else, something unseen, had already crossed the threshold with her. And as the firelight touched her face and the frost began to melt from her sleeves, Elias Crow understood one thing with a certainty that felt heavier than the winter pressing against his walls. This night was not going to pass quietly, not like the others, not like the years before it, because some choices didn't end when you made them, they just began. The fire cracked low as Elias Crow moved a few steps back, giving her space without ever turning his back, his eyes tracking every small movement as she stepped inside, slow, deliberate, as if she had already decided where she belonged in the room before crossing the threshold. The storm cut off behind the door, but still pressing against it. Wind rattling the frame in long, steady breaths that filled the silence neither of them seemed eager to break. And for a moment, all that could be heard was the faint drip of melting ice from her sleeves hitting the wooden floor one drop at a time, steady as a clock, counting something neither of them had named yet. Elias gestured once toward the fire, not speaking, just a small motion of his hand, and she moved closer without hesitation, lowering herself near the flames with a kind of control that did not match the condition she appeared to be in, not collapsing, not trembling, just sitting, hands held out to the heat, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. And that was the third thing Elias noticed, because people pulled from the edge of freezing did not move like that. They shook, they gasped, they clung to the warmth like it might vanish. But she did none of those things. She simply absorbed it, quiet, steady, her eyes drifting briefly around the cabin, taking in the walls, the table, the rifle mounted above the door, the single chair across from the fire, the small details a stranger might miss, but she did not. And when her gaze returned to him, it did not linger long, just enough to acknowledge that he was still there, still watching, still deciding. Elias reached for the kettle hanging near the fire, pouring water into a tin cup with hands that remained steady out of habit more than comfort. And he set it down within her reach, close enough that she could take it. Without leaning toward him, far enough that he did not have to step closer than he already had. She picked it up without a word, fingers brushing the metal as if testing it, then bringing it to her lips in small, measured sips, not hurried, not desperate, and that quiet stretched between them again, thicker now, filled with questions neither of them spoke, until Elias finally broke it, his voice low, even. You are a long way from anywhere that would keep you alive in a storm like this. The words were not an accusation, not quite a question, just a statement placed between them like a marker on the ground. She lowered the cup slightly, considering it, then answered just as evenly, "So are you." And something in the way she said it made the room feel smaller, not tighter, just more aware, as if the walls themselves were listening. Elias did not respond right away. Instead, he moved to place another piece of wood on the fire, the flames rising a little higher, casting light across her face, revealing the faint lines of exhaustion beneath the calm, the slight stiffness in her shoulders that spoke of distance traveled, cold endured, and still control maintained. He had seen people on the edge before, seen what it did to them, how it stripped away everything but instinct. But she was holding something back, something stronger than the cold, and that unsettled him more than the storm outside ever could. You said you would reward me, he said after a moment, not because he expected an answer, but because the words had stayed with him. Out of place in a night like this, she looked at him then, directly, and for the first time there was something in her expression that shifted, not softer, not warmer, just clearer. I did not say I might, she replied. I said I will. And there was no emphasis in it. No weight added to the words, just certainty, like stating the distance between 2 points on a map. And Elias felt that same quiet tension return, stronger now. Because promises made in storms rarely meant what they sounded like. And yet he found himself asking anyway. And what makes you so sure I would let you stay long enough to give it? She tilted her head slightly, considering him the way one might consider a path before walking it, then answered, because you already decided. And for a moment Elias almost smiled, not out of humor, but recognition, because she was not wrong. The decision had been made the second he touched the latch. Everything after that was just a man pretending he still had choices left. The fire popped softly, sending a brief spray of sparks upward before settling again. And outside the wind shifted, not weaker, just different, carrying a sound that did not belong to the storm, faint, distant. But there, Elias turned his head slightly toward the door, listening. The rhythm was subtle, easy to miss if a man did not know what to listen for. But he did. Years of open land had taught him the difference between wind and movement, between noise and intention. And this was not the storm. He did not move toward the door, did not reach for the rifle. He simply listened, counting the space between each faint sound, measuring it. And when he looked back at her, She was already watching him, not surprised, not alarmed, just aware. "You hear them," she said quietly, not a question. Elias held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, slow, controlled. "Horses," he said, and the words settled into the room like something heavy, something that did not belong inside walls. She turned her eyes briefly toward the door, as if she could see through it, then back to the fire. "They have been there since before I reached your door," she said, and that was when. The night shifted again, not with sound, not with movement, but with understanding, because Elias realized then that whatever had come with the storm had not followed her, it had arrived with her. And for the first time since opening that door, he felt the full weight of the choice he had made. Not fear, not regret. Just the quiet knowledge that the storm outside was no longer the only thing pressing against his home. The wind pressed harder against the cabin walls, not louder, just heavier, like something leaning in close, listening the same way Elias Crow now listened. His body still, but his senses stretched outward past the wood, past the firelight, into the dark where those faint movements circled in patient silence, not approaching, not retreating, just there, steady as breath, and that was what made it worse, because men who meant harm rushed, made noise, showed themselves, but whatever waited outside had no need to do any of that. It already knew where he was, already knew he had opened the door, already knew he had chosen. Elias reached slowly for the rifle mounted above the doorway, not raising it, not pointing it, just taking it down with care. The familiar weight settling into his hands like something remembered rather than something needed. He rested it against the wall. Within reach, a quiet acknowledgement rather than a threat. And when he turned back, she had not moved, still seated by the fire, her hands now relaxed in her lap, the heat having done its work, but her posture unchanged, composed, as if the cold had never truly owned her in the first place. "You knew they were there," he said, his voice low but steady, not accusing, just placing another truth between them. She nodded once, a small motion that carried no hesitation. "Yes," she said, and nothing more. The simplicity of it settling into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Elias studied her for a moment longer, then asked, "And you came anyway?" She looked at him then, not defiant, not defensive, just direct. "I had to." And for the first time there was something beneath the calm, not fear, not urgency, something deeper, something that did not belong to the storm or the night, something tied to purpose. And Elias felt that same quiet tension shift again, because people who had to do something rarely explained why. They simply did it. And he had seen enough of the world to know that those reasons were not always simple. The fire cracked again, louder this time. A sharp pop that broke the silence for a heartbeat before it settled back into its steady rhythm. And outside, the faint sound of hooves shifted slightly, not closer, not farther, just adjusting, like a circle tightening by inches no one could measure. Elias walked to the small window beside the door, brushing a thin layer of frost from the glass with the back of his hand, the cold biting instantly against his skin as he cleared just enough to see through. The world beyond was a blur of white and shadow, the storm swallowing distance and shape. But there, at the edge of sight, movement, not fast, not hidden, just present, dark forms against the pale ground. And they did not move like men searching. They moved like men waiting. Elias let the frost creep back over the glass as he stepped away, his mind working through what little he could see, what little he could know, and what he had already chosen. "They are not trying to come in," he said, more to himself than to her. She answered anyway. "They will not." And there it was again, that certainty, not hope, not belief, certainty. Elias turned back to her, narrowing his eyes slightly. "Why?" he asked. And this time the word carried weight, not demand, but expectation. She held his gaze for a long moment, the firelight catching in her eyes, reflecting something steady, something that did not waver. "Because they are waiting to see what kind of man you are," she said, and the words settled deeper than anything else she had spoken, deeper than the storm, deeper than the presence outside, because it was not a threat, not a warning. It was a measure, and Elias felt something in his chest tighten, not from fear, but from recognition, because he had lived long enough to know that a man was not defined by what he said or what he carried, but by the choices he made when no one was supposed to be watching. And now, Someone was. He let out a slow breath, the kind that did not release tension so much as accept it, and he moved back toward the fire, lowering himself into the chair across from her, the rifle still within reach but forgotten for the moment. "You could have told me," he said, not accusing, just stating what had not been said. She tilted her head slightly, considering him again. "Would it have changed your choice?" she asked, and Elias did not answer right away, because the truth of that question did not come easy. It sat there between them, heavy, waiting, and after a long moment, he shook his head once. "Slow, no," he said, and that was the fourth thing she seemed to notice, because something in her expression shifted again, not into a smile, not into relief, just a small, almost imperceptible easing, as if a piece of something had fallen into place exactly where it belonged. The wind outside eased for a brief second, just enough for the silence to deepen, and in that space, Elias heard it again. Not hooves this time, not movement, something else, a stillness that did not belong to emptiness, but to presence. And he realized then that whatever waited outside was not waiting for him to fail, not waiting to break down his door or take what he had. It was waiting for him to reveal himself, to show something that could not be seen from a distance. And as he sat there across from her, the fire between them casting light and shadow in equal measure, Elias Crow understood that the night had already decided something about him. He just had not yet heard what it was. The fire had settled into a steady burn, low and patient, casting a warm glow that should have made the cabin feel safe. But safety had a different meaning now, and Elias Crow could feel it in the way the silence held its shape. Not empty, not peaceful, but waiting, always waiting. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, forearms resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the woman across from him, studying the small details he had missed before. The way her breathing never fully slowed, the way her gaze moved not randomly but with purpose, marking distances, measuring exits, understanding the space as if it mattered. And that was when he realized something else. She was not here to be saved. She was here because she chose to be. And that thought settled heavier than the storm outside. "They are not here for me," he said quietly, not asking, just stating what had begun to take shape in his mind. She did not answer right away, her eyes dropping briefly to the fire as if the flames themselves held something worth considering, then lifting back to him with that same calm certainty. "No," she said, and the word did not carry relief, only truth. Elias nodded once, slow, absorbing it, because that meant something different, something that shifted the weight of the night entirely. If they were not here for him, then they were here for her, and yet they did not come, did not knock, did not speak. They waited, and that kind of waiting was not about taking, it was about witnessing. "You said they are watching," he continued, his voice steady but quieter now, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something unseen. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging it. "They are," she said, "and they will not leave until they understand." Elias exhaled slowly, the breath visible for just a moment in the cooler air near the floor before fading. "Understand what?" he asked, and this time the question carried something more, not just curiosity, but the weight of a man beginning to see the shape of something larger than himself. She held his gaze without hesitation, and for the first time there was something almost human in it. Not just calm, not just control, but a quiet echo of something deeper, something that had brought her to his door in the first place. "If you opened your door because you are kind," she said, "or because you are not afraid." The words landed softly, but they did not feel soft. They settled into the space between them like a measure, like something being placed on a scale that had already been set. Elias frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in thought, because those were not the same thing, not even close. Kindness could be mistaken, could be given without understanding, but a lack of fear that came from somewhere else, somewhere a man built over time, and he had not decided which one he had shown tonight. Not fully, maybe not at all. The fire shifted again, a log settling deeper into the coals, sending a brief wave of heat outward that touched his face before fading. And in that moment, the wind outside dropped just enough for the quiet to stretch farther than it had before. Elias stood slowly, not abruptly, just enough to feel the weight of his own movement, and he walked to the door, stopping a few feet away, not reaching for it, not opening it, just standing there, as if the wood itself held something he needed to hear. And for a long moment, he said nothing, did nothing, simply listened. Because the storm was still there, but it had changed, not weaker, not gone. Just less important, and beneath it, that same presence remained, steady, unhurried, patient as time itself, and Elias understood then that whatever this was, whatever he had stepped into when he lifted that latch, it was not something that could be rushed or forced. It would reveal itself only when it chose to, and only if he remained exactly as he was. He turned back toward her, his expression no longer guarded, not relaxed either, just clear, as if something inside him had settled into place. "You said you would reward me," he said again. But this time the words carried a different tone, not questioning, not skeptical, just acknowledging what had already been set in motion. She watched him closely, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if measuring something she had not been certain of before, and then she rose to her feet, smooth, controlled, the movement quiet but deliberate, and for a moment they stood facing each other across the fire, the light casting shadows that shifted with every flicker of flame. "I will," she said, her voice no louder than before, but somehow heavier, as if the meaning behind it had deepened without changing. Elias did not move, did not step closer, did not step back. He simply nodded once, and in that small motion, something unseen seemed to shift again, because outside, in the distance, the faint sound of hooves stopped entirely, not fading, not retreating, just still, as if whatever waited beyond those walls had heard enough. And for the first time since the night began, Elias Crow felt something unfamiliar settle into the silence. Not fear, not doubt, but the quiet understanding that the storm had never been the real test. The door had been, and he had already opened it. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling into the cabin like something alive, something that had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. And Elias Crow stood there near the door, feeling it press against him not from the outside, but from within the space he had chosen to open. The fire behind him burned steady but softer now, its warmth no longer the center of the room. Something else had taken that place, something quieter, heavier, and when he turned back toward her, he saw that she was no longer simply standing. She was watching him in a way she had not before, not measuring distance, not reading movement, but seeing, as if whatever answer she had been waiting for had finally been given without words. "It is done," she said, and the words were not loud, not emphasized, just placed into the air like something final. Elias did not ask what she meant, because something in him already understood that whatever had been decided tonight was not something either of them could explain in simple terms. It had already passed beyond that. He walked slowly back toward the fire, stopping just short of it, his hands resting at his sides, not tense, not relaxed, simply present, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the wind outside easing into a low, distant hum, the kind that no longer demanded attention, because it had lost its place as the loudest thing in the world. And then, without warning, she moved, stepping past the fire with quiet certainty, heading toward the door. Elias watched her, not stopping her, not questioning, just observing as she reached for the latch, her hand resting on it for a brief second, as if acknowledging the same choice he had made earlier, and then she opened it, the door swinging outward into the pale, frozen dawn that had begun to rise unnoticed. The storm had not ended, but it had softened, the sky no longer black, but washed in a dull gray light that stretched across the land like a held breath. And beyond that threshold, they were there, not shadows anymore, not distant shapes, but men, mounted, still, arranged in a wide circle that held the cabin at its center, their presence undeniable now, not threatening, not advancing, simply there, waiting exactly as they had been all night. Elias stepped closer, stopping just behind her, his gaze moving across the scene without haste, taking in the number of them, the way they sat their horses, the way none of them reached for anything, none of them spoke, and yet the silence carried more weight than any words could have. She stepped forward onto the frozen ground, the cold air catching her breath but not slowing her stride, and as she moved, something shifted among them, not a rush, not a reaction, just a change, like the first movement in a pattern already understood, and then, one by one, beginning. With the man at the front, they dismounted, the motion slow, deliberate, controlled, boots meeting the ground in quiet unison, and Elias felt something in his chest tighten, not from fear, but from the recognition of what he was seeing, because this was not an approach, not a confrontation, it was something else entirely, something he had not expected, something he had not even considered. The first man stepped forward, older than the others, his posture straight, his presence steady, and he stopped several feet away from her, his gaze lifting to meet hers with something that could not be mistaken, not authority, not command, but acknowledgement, and then, without a word, he lowered his head, just slightly, not in submission, not in weakness, but in respect, and behind him, the others followed, not all at once, not perfectly synchronized, but one by one, like a ripple moving through still water, heads bowing, shoulders easing, the entire circle shifting into something that Elias could not name, but could feel, something that carried weight far beyond the moment itself. He stood there in the doorway, the cold air pressing against him now, but he did not step back, did not retreat into the warmth behind him, because he understood, finally, that this was the reward she had spoken of, not gold, not land, not anything that could be held or measured, but something far more rare in a place like this, recognition, not of what he had, not of who he claimed to be, but of what he had chosen when no one was supposed to be watching. She turned slightly then, just enough for her eyes to find his again, and for the first time since she had arrived, there was something unmistakable in them, not mystery, not distance, but gratitude, quiet and deep and unspoken, and she inclined her head once, a small motion that carried more meaning than any words could have, and in that moment, Elias Crow realized that the night had not been about survival, not about danger, not even about the storm. It had been about a single choice made in silence, and the kind of man that choice revealed. And as the first light of morning spread across the frozen land, touching the circle of men, the cabin, and the two figures standing between them, he understood that some rewards did not come with sound or celebration. They came with stillness, with quiet, with the kind of respect that could only be given, never taken, and once given, never forgotten. The morning did not rush in. It unfolded slowly, like the land itself was taking time to acknowledge what had just passed, the gray light stretching farther across the snow, softening the sharp edges of the world, and Elias Crow stood in the doorway without moving, the cold pressing against his coat, his breath visible in steady, quiet rhythm. But he did not step back inside, because something in him understood that leaving this moment too soon would be like closing a door that had taken a lifetime to open. The circle of men remained still, their heads lowered not in submission, but in recognition, and the weight of that silence carried farther than any words could have. The older man at the front lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting Elias with a calm that did not challenge, did not question, only acknowledged, and for a long second the two men stood there, separated by distance, but connected by something that had nothing to do with land or language, something older than either of them, something that did not need to be explained. Elias gave a small nod, not out of habit, not out of politeness, but because it felt right, and the man returned it just as simply, and with that, the moment shifted again, not broken, just completed. The woman beside him stepped forward once more, moving down the single worn step from the cabin to the frozen ground, her posture no longer guarded, no longer measured, just steady, and as she passed the older man, he stepped aside without hesitation, not leading her, not guiding her, simply allowing her path to remain her own, and the others followed in quiet understanding, returning to their horses one by one, the movement smooth, controlled, no urgency, no hesitation, as if this had never been about arrival or departure, only about witnessing. Elias watched them, taking in the details he had missed in the dark, the patterns on their clothing, the way they carried themselves, the calm that ran through the entire group like a shared breath, and he realized that none of them looked at him with suspicion. None of them measured him the way strangers often did. They had already done that, sometime in the night, in the silence he had thought belonged only to himself. And now there was nothing left to prove. The older man mounted his horse last, pausing for just a moment before turning slightly in the saddle, his gaze finding Elias one final time, and though he said nothing, the meaning was clear enough. Not a warning, not a promise, just an understanding that would remain long after the tracks in the snow had faded. Then, without signal or sound, they began to move, the circle breaking apart as naturally as it had formed, horses turning toward the open land, their figures gradually blending back into the distance, not vanishing, not hiding, simply returning to the world they had come from. And Elias stood there until the last of them disappeared beyond. The low rise to the east, the quiet settling in again, but different now, not heavy, not waiting, just still, the way a place feels after something important has passed through it and left its mark behind. He finally stepped back inside, closing the door gently, the latch falling into place with a soft, final sound. And for a moment he stood there in the center of the room, the fire still burning, the cup still resting where she had left it, the small details of the night unchanged, and yet everything felt different, as if the space itself had shifted in a way that could not be seen but could not be ignored. He moved slowly to the fire, adding another piece of wood without thinking, watching the flames catch and rise again. And as the warmth spread through the cabin, he let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding, not from tension, not from fear, but from something deeper, something that had settled into him without asking. And then his eyes moved to the door once more, not expecting it to open again, not expecting anyone to return, but acknowledging what had happened there, the simple act of opening it, of choosing, of not turning away. And he understood then that whatever had been given to him this morning was not something that would leave with the tracks in the snow. It would stay, quiet, unseen, shaping the way he stood in the world from that day forward and outside. The storm continued to fade, the sky lifting slowly into a pale blue that stretched across the plains without end. And for the first time in a long while, Elias Crow did not feel alone in the silence, because some presences did not need to remain to be felt. They only needed to be recognized once, and that was enough. The day did not rush forward. It lingered, stretching itself thin across the frozen plains as if even time needed a moment to settle after what had passed. And Elias Crow moved through his cabin slower than usual, not out of fatigue, not out of age, but because something inside him had shifted its pace. The same table stood where it always had, the same worn chair near the fire, the same kettle hanging by the iron hook, and yet each thing felt newly placed, as if the room had been rearranged. Without moving a single object, he picked up the tin cup she had used, turning it once in his hand, noticing the faint warmth still clinging to the metal despite the cold air, and for a moment he simply held it, not thinking, not questioning, just acknowledging that it had been there, that she had been there. And then he set it back down exactly where it had rested before, not out of habit, but out of respect for the quiet that had followed her leaving. Outside the wind had calmed to a low breath that moved across the land without urgency, the snow no longer driven sideways but resting in long, untouched stretches that caught the morning light in a soft glow. Elias stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking under his boots as he looked out across the open distance. The tracks were still there, faint but visible, a wide circle pressed into the snow where the horses had stood through the night, and in the center of it all, the marks of his own doorway, the place where the choice had been made. He studied those tracks for a long moment, not counting them, not measuring them, just seeing them for what they were, proof of something that had happened without needing to be understood. And as the light shifted higher in the sky, the edges of those prints began to soften, the sun touching them gently, beginning the slow work of erasing what the night had left behind. And Elias felt no urgency to preserve them, no need to mark them or remember them in any way beyond what already sat quietly in his chest, because some things did not need to be held on to. They stayed whether you reached for them or not. He stepped down from the porch and walked a few feet into the open ground, the snow crunching softly beneath his weight, the air sharp but no longer biting. And he stopped where the circle had been strongest, where the presence had felt closest, and he stood there, hands at his sides, breathing steady, letting the silence settle again, not empty, not heavy, just present. And for the first time in a long while, he realized that the silence did not belong to loneliness anymore. It belonged to something else, something shared, even if only for a single night. And that thought stayed with him as he turned back toward the cabin. The simple structure standing unchanged against the vast land, its walls weathered, its roof worn, and yet now it felt different, not stronger, not safer, just known, as if it had been seen and accepted in a way it never had before. He paused at the door before stepping inside, his hand resting briefly on the wood where the latch met the frame. The same place he had touched in the dark, the same place where everything had begun, and he let his fingers linger there for just a second longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but acknowledgement. Then he pushed the door open and stepped back into the warmth, the fire still burning steady, the room unchanged, and yet the quiet that greeted him felt fuller, not crowded, not loud, just complete. He moved through his usual tasks without hurry, adding wood to the fire, checking the small supplies near the wall, pouring water into the kettle again. Each motion familiar, grounded, but now carrying a different weight, as if each small act mattered in a way it had not before. And as the hours passed, the light outside grew brighter, the sky clearing into a pale blue that stretched without interruption, the storm finally giving way to something calmer, something that felt earned rather than given. Elias sat in his chair by the fire, looking toward the window, watching the last traces of movement fade from the land, and he realized then that nothing had been taken from him that night. Nothing had been lost or changed in any way he could point to, and yet something had been added, something that did not have a name, did not have a shape, but sat quietly within him, steady and certain. And as he leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under his weight, he let out a slow breath, the kind that did not come from exhaustion, but from understanding, because out here, where the land stretched farther than a man could walk in a day, where the wind could erase tracks and stories alike, the only things that truly remained were the choices a man made when no one was there to see them. And now, he knew that sometimes someone was. The light continued to stretch across the plains, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but steady now, filling every corner of the land Elias Crow could see from his window. And with it came a quiet that felt different from the one he had known before, not empty, not waiting, but settled, like something had found its place and no longer needed to move. He rose from his chair without thinking, his body following a rhythm built from years of repetition, checking the small things first, the fire, the kettle, the worn shelf by the wall. Each task simple, each motion familiar, and yet beneath it all there was a new awareness, subtle but constant, as if the space around him carried more weight than it had the day before. He stepped outside again, just as the sun cleared the low ridge to the east, the light catching the last traces of frost on the ground, turning them into something that shimmered for a brief moment before fading. And he paused on the porch, letting the air settle against him, the cold still there but softer now, easier to stand in, easier to breathe. The wide circle in the snow had nearly disappeared, the edges smoothed by the sun, the details lost to time already, and Elias did not feel the need to step closer this time, did not feel the need to stand where they had stood, because the place itself was no longer important. The moment had already passed beyond it. He looked out across the distance, the land stretching in every direction without interruption, and for a moment it felt larger than it had before, not because it had changed, but because something inside him had shifted the way he stood within it. And then, faint at first, almost lost beneath the open quiet, came a sound, not the wind, not the creak of wood or the distant cry of an animal, something else, something measured, and Elias turned his head slightly, listening without moving, because he had learned that not every sound demanded a reaction, some only asked to be heard. The rhythm grew clearer after a moment, not rushed, not hidden, just present, a single horse moving across the open ground, unhurried, steady, and Elias did not reach for anything, did not step back. He simply watched as the figure appeared over the low rise, small at first, then clearer as it moved closer, the rider sitting straight, the movement familiar in a way he could not explain, and as the distance closed, he recognized her, not by her face, not by her clothing, but by the way she carried herself, the same quiet control, the same steady presence that had filled his doorway the night before. She guided the horse to a stop several yards from the cabin, not too close, not too far, the space between them measured and intentional, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence returning. But now it felt different again, not heavy, not testing, just shared. She dismounted with the same ease as before, her boots touching the ground without sound, and she took a few steps forward, stopping where the edge of the porch met the open land, her eyes lifting to meet his. And there was no question in them now, no measuring, only something clear and settled. "You stayed the same," she said quietly, and the words carried no surprise, only confirmation. Elias considered that for a moment, then gave a small nod. "So did you," he replied, and something in her expression shifted, not into a smile, not quite, but into something close enough that it softened the space between them. She reached into the fold of her coat and drew out a small object, something wrapped in worn leather, simple, unadorned, and she held it out toward him without stepping closer, not offering it like a gift, but placing it in the space between them like a continuation of something already begun. Elias stepped down from the porch, closing the distance by a few feet, his movements slow, deliberate, and he took the object in his hand, feeling the weight of it, light but present. And when he unwrapped the leather, he found a small pendant, carved from stone, its surface smooth, marked with lines that seemed simple at first glance but carried a pattern that felt older than anything he could name. He looked up at her, not asking what it meant, because something told him it was not meant to be explained, and she gave a single nod, as if confirming that understanding. "It will remind you," she said, her voice steady, and Elias closed his hand around the pendant, not gripping it tightly, just holding it, letting its presence settle the same way everything else had, without force. Without question, she stepped back then, returning to her horse with the same quiet certainty, and as she mounted, she looked at him one last time, not to measure, not to test, just to see. And then she turned, guiding the horse back toward the open land, her figure moving away without hurry, without hesitation, and Elias stood there watching until she disappeared beyond the same rise the others had taken, the silence returning once more. But now it carried something else within it, something that did not fade with distance. He remained where he was for a long moment, the pendant resting in his hand, the sun rising higher above the plains, and as the light spread across the land, Elias Crow understood that some doors, once opened, never truly closed again. They simply changed the way a man walked through the world beyond them. The pendant felt warmer than it should have in the cold morning air, not hot, not unnatural, just steady, as if it carried a quiet heat that did not come from the sun or the fire behind him. And Elias Crow stood there for a long moment after she disappeared beyond the rise, his hand closed loosely around the small piece of stone, his eyes still fixed on the empty space where she had been, not expecting her to return, not hoping, just acknowledging that something had passed through his life and left a mark that would not fade with distance. The land stretched wide and open before him, the snow now softening under the growing light, the sky clear and endless. And for a moment, everything felt simple again, the way it had before the storm, before the voice at his door, before the choice. And yet beneath that simplicity, something remained, something quiet and constant, like a thread running through everything he saw. He turned slowly and stepped back onto the porch, the wood creaking under his weight, and then into the cabin, closing the door behind him without hurry, the latch falling into place with the same familiar sound. But it no longer marked separation, not from the outside, not from anything. It simply marked a boundary that no longer felt absolute. He moved to the table and set the pendant down for a moment, unwrapping it again, letting the light from the window fall across its surface, the carved lines catching the brightness in a way that revealed more detail than before, patterns that did not follow straight paths, but curved and connected, forming something that looked less like decoration and more like a story, though he could not read it, not in any way he understood, and still, it felt like something meant to be remembered rather than explained. He picked it up again, turning it once between his fingers, then slipped it into his coat pocket, not as a possession, not as something to keep safe, but as something to carry, something that belonged with him now whether he fully understood it or not. The fire crackled softly behind him, the kettle beginning to hum as the water warmed again, and Elias moved through the small tasks of the morning with steady hands, each motion grounding him, each step familiar, and yet every now and then, his mind returned to the same place, the moment at the door, the voice, the decision, not replaying it, not questioning it, just returning to it. like a man might return to a path he had walked once and now knew by memory alone. Hours passed without notice, the sun climbing higher, the shadows shortening across the floor, and the quiet remained, but it no longer felt like something that needed to be filled. It felt complete on its own, and that was new. That was different, because before, silence had always carried something missing, something absent. Now it carried something present, something that stayed even when nothing else moved. And as Elias stepped outside once more to check the far fence line, his boots pressing into the softening snow, he paused halfway across the open ground, his eyes drawn to a spot near the edge of the clearing where something caught the light differently. Not bright, not obvious, just enough to be noticed. If a man was paying attention, he walked toward it slowly, his steps measured, and when he reached it, he saw that the snow there had not melted the same way as the rest, a small patch, no larger than a foot across, where the surface remained untouched, undisturbed, and in the center of it, a single mark, not a footprint, not a hoofprint, something else, a shape pressed lightly into the snow, shallow but clear, a pattern that echoed the lines carved into the pendant now resting in his pocket. And Elias crouched slightly, studying it, not reaching out, not disturbing it, just seeing it for what it was, a sign, not left by accident, not shaped by chance, but placed, deliberate and quiet. And he felt that same stillness settle into him again, not as a question, not as a mystery to solve, but as an answer already given. He straightened slowly, his gaze lifting back to the open land, and for the first time, he understood that the reward she had spoken of was not something that ended with her leaving. It was something that continued, something that would appear in small ways, quiet ways, ways that did not demand attention but rewarded it. And as he stood there in the growing light, the wind moving gently across the plains, Elias Crow realized that the world had not changed around him. The land was the same, the sky was the same, the distance was the same, but the way he stood within it, that had changed. And once that kind of change took hold, it did not fade, it did not pass. It remained, steady and certain, like a door that, once opened, could never truly be closed again. The mark in the snow did not fade with the others, not right away, not even as the sun climbed higher and the rest of the ground softened into slush and memory. It remained just long enough for Elias Crow to understand that it was never meant to last, only to be seen, and that realization settled into him the same way everything else had since the storm, quiet, steady, without demand. He stood there for a moment longer, then turned back toward the cabin, his boots leaving clear impressions. Behind him, ordinary tracks, nothing special, nothing marked, and yet he noticed them now in a way he never had before. Each step a choice, each path a line drawn across the land that would eventually disappear, but still mattered while it existed. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open, the warmth inside meeting him without resistance, and for a brief second he paused on the threshold again, not because he hesitated, but because he recognized the place for what it had become, not just a shelter from the cold, not just a place to pass time, but a place where something unseen had taken shape. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, the latch falling into place with that same familiar sound, and he moved toward the table, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out the pendant once more, the stone catching the light from the window, its carved lines clearer now. Or perhaps his eyes were simply seeing them differently. He traced them with his thumb, not trying to understand, just following their path, the curves, the intersections, the way they seemed to move, without beginning or end. And for a moment it felt like looking at something that did not belong to time in the way everything else did, something that did not rush or fade. It simply remained. He set it down again and poured water into the cup, taking a slow drink, the warmth grounding him, bringing him back into the rhythm of the day. And yet even as he moved through the familiar motions, something lingered at the edge of his awareness. Not a sound, not a presence, just a feeling that the quiet was not empty, that it carried something with it now, something that did not need to be seen to be known. The hours passed, the sun reaching its highest point before beginning its slow descent, the light shifting across the floor in long, steady lines, and Elias found himself returning to the door more than once, not opening it, not stepping outside, just standing there for a moment, listening, not for anything specific, just listening. And each time, The same answer came back, nothing. And yet it did not feel like absence. It felt like completion, like a conversation that had already been finished, the final words spoken without sound. As the afternoon stretched on, he finally stepped outside again. The air colder now as the sun began to dip, the shadows growing longer across the land. And he walked farther this time, beyond the edge of the clearing, past the place where the circle had been, out toward the open stretch where the horizon met the sky. His steps unhurried, his gaze steady, and when he stopped, it was not because he had reached a destination, but because something in him had settled, the same quiet understanding returning, not as a thought, not as a question, but as something deeper, something that did not need to be named. He reached into his pocket again, pulling out the pendant, holding it loosely in his hand as he looked out across the land. And for a moment he closed his eyes, not in reflection, not in memory, just in stillness, letting the wind move past him, letting the world exist without needing to define it. And when he opened them again, nothing had changed. The land was the same, the sky was the same, the distance was the same, and yet everything felt different, not because of what had happened, but because of how he now stood within it. And as the light began to fade, the first hints of evening settling into the edges of the world, Elias Crow understood something that had been there all along, something he had never needed words to know, that out here, where a man could live for years without being seen, without being known, it was easy to believe that his choices did not matter, that they disappeared as quickly as tracks in the snow. But that was not true, not entirely, because sometimes, without warning, without reason, someone was there, watching not to judge, not to take, but to understand. And when that moment came, when that quiet test revealed itself, it did not ask for strength, it did not ask for proof, it asked only one thing, whether a man would open the door. And as Elias stood there in the fading light, the pendant resting in his hand, the wind moving gently across the plains, he knew that he had answered that question, not with words, not with intention, but with a single, simple choice. And that answer would remain long after the snow had melted, long after the tracks had vanished, long after the night itself had been forgotten by the world, because some things were not meant to be remembered. They were meant to be lived, and once lived, they never truly left. The evening settled in without urgency, the sky dimming from pale blue to a deeper shade that carried the promise of cold returning with the night. And Elias Crow stood at the edge of his land longer than he needed to, the pendant still resting in his hand, his fingers tracing its surface without thought, not seeking answers, just feeling its presence as the wind moved gently around him, quieter now, almost respectful, as if the land itself understood that something had already been said and did not need repeating. He finally turned back toward the cabin, his steps steady, unhurried, the familiar path beneath his boots no different than it had been the day before, and yet each step felt more certain, more grounded, as if he was no longer simply moving through the land but standing within it, belonging in a way that did not come from ownership or claim, but from understanding. The door opened with the same soft creak, the fire inside still holding its heat, and he stepped into the warmth as the last light of day slipped behind the horizon, the shadows stretching across the room in long, quiet lines. He set the pendant on the table again, not out of hesitation, but as a way of letting it rest, letting it be part of the space rather than something he carried alone. And he moved to tend the fire, adding wood with practiced hands, watching the flames catch and rise, the glow filling the room with a steady light that pushed back the darkness without fighting it, just existing alongside it. And as he sat down once more, the chair settling beneath him, he found his gaze drifting toward the door again, not expecting a voice this time, not expecting a knock, but acknowledging the place where everything had changed, the threshold that had separated one life from another without ever moving. And he realized then that the quiet he felt was not the absence of something, it was the presence of something new, something that did not need to announce itself to be known. The fire crackled softly, the sound familiar, grounding, and Elias leaned back slightly, his eyes half focused on the shifting light. And for a moment, his thoughts did not wander, they did not question or revisit. They simply rested, and that in itself felt unfamiliar, because for years the silence had been filled with what was missing, with what had been lost or left behind. but now it was filled with what had been given, and that difference changed everything. The wind brushed lightly against the walls, no longer a force to be endured, just a presence to be acknowledged, and as the night deepened, the stars began to appear one by one beyond the small window, faint at first, then clearer as the darkness settled fully across the land. Elias rose once more, stepping toward the window, his gaze lifting to the sky, and he stood there for a long moment, looking out at the vastness above, the same sky he had seen every night for years, and yet now it felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had, and that understanding came without effort, without resistance. It simply was, and as he turned away, moving back toward the table, his hand brushed lightly against the pendant again, and for a brief second he paused, not picking it up, not holding it, just letting his fingers rest against it, acknowledging it as part of the room, part of the moment, part of the life he was still living. And then he let his hand fall away, returning to the quiet rhythm of the night, the fire burning low, the air growing cooler, the world outside settling into stillness. And as Elias Crow sat there in the soft light, the silence around him no longer empty, no longer waiting, but complete, he understood something that did not need words, something that would not change with time or distance, that the measure of a man was not taken in the moments when he was seen, when he was judged by others or defined by what he claimed to be. It was taken in the moments when no one was supposed to be there, when the choice stood alone in the dark, and a door either remained closed or opened. And as the fire settled into embers and the night wrapped itself gently around the cabin, Elias closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in sleep, not in fatigue, but in quiet acknowledgement, because he knew now, with a certainty that did not need to be proven, that somewhere beyond the reach of his sight, beyond the distance of the land, that choice had been seen, and that was enough. The night passed without interruption, not because nothing moved, but because nothing needed to, the kind of stillness that does not come from emptiness, but from balance. And Elias Crow slept lightly in his chair by the fire, not fully resting, not fully awake, the way a man does when he has spent years listening for things that rarely come. And when morning returned, it did so quietly again, not with the force of a storm or the sharpness of cold, but with a soft light that slipped through the window and settled across the floor, touching the edges of the table, the chair, the pendant resting where he had left it. And for a moment he remained still, his eyes half open, watching the light rather than reacting to it, because something in him no longer felt the need to rise quickly, to check, to confirm. The world outside would be as it was, and whatever had changed was not out there. It was within the way he now met it. He stood after a while, slow and steady, his joints stiff but familiar, and he moved to the window, brushing aside the thin layer of frost that had formed overnight, the cold biting lightly against his skin but no longer unwelcome. Just another part of the day. The land beyond was calm, untouched. The snow now settled into a quiet surface that held no new marks, no signs of movement, and yet Elias did not look for them anymore. He simply observed, letting his gaze move across the distance without searching for anything in particular. And as he stood there, he realized that the expectation he had carried for years, the quiet habit of waiting for something to happen, something to break the stillness, had faded, not completely, but enough that it no longer shaped every moment. He turned back into the room, his eyes resting briefly on the pendant again, and this time he picked it up without hesitation, not to examine it, not to question it, but to carry it with him as he stepped outside, the morning air meeting him with a gentle cold, the kind that woke the senses without demanding anything from them. And he walked out into the open land once more, his path not fixed, not chosen, just taken, his boots pressing into the snow with quiet certainty, each step leaving a mark that would fade, but still mattered in the moment it existed. He moved farther than he had the day before, past the edge of the clearing, into a stretch of land that felt the same and yet different, as if distance itself had shifted in meaning. And when he stopped, it was not because he had reached a boundary, but because something within him had found its place. He stood there for a long moment, the pendant resting in his hand, the wind brushing lightly past him, and he did not look for signs, did not listen for sounds beyond what was already there, because he understood now that not everything needed to be revealed again to be real. Some things remained in the way a man carried himself, in the way he stood, in the way he chose without knowing who might see. And as the sun climbed higher, warming the surface of the land just enough to soften its edges, Elias Crow felt a quiet certainty settle deeper into him, not as a thought, not as a conclusion, but as something that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. And for the first time in a long while, the silence around him did not ask anything of him. It did not challenge or question. It simply existed, and he existed within it, steady, unchanged in the ways that mattered, changed in the ways that could not be seen. And as he turned back toward the cabin, his steps unhurried, his gaze calm, he carried that understanding with him, not as a burden, not as a responsibility, but as something simple, something clear, like a door that had once been closed and now stood open, not demanding that he walk through it again, only reminding him that he could. And as he reached the porch and stepped inside once more, the warmth greeting him without difference, the fire waiting, the room unchanged, he placed the pendant back on the table with quiet care, not because it needed to be set aside, but because it had already done what it was meant to do. It had shown him something he could now carry without it. And as he sat down once more, the chair settling beneath him, the light filling the room, Elias Crow understood that whatever had come to his door that night had not come to change his life in some grand, visible way. It had come to reveal something that had been there all along, something simple, something quiet, something that did not need to be proven, only lived, and once lived, it remained, steady and certain, like the land itself stretching beyond the reach of sight, unchanged and yet never the same. The days did not change in any way a man could point to. The sun still rose over the same low ridge. The wind still crossed the plains with the same quiet persistence. The cabin still stood where it always had, worn and steady against the wide stretch of land. And Elias Crow moved through those days the way he always had, tending the fire, checking the fence, walking the same paths that had long ago become part of him. And yet there was something beneath it all that no longer matched the life he had known before, not louder, not brighter, just deeper, like a second layer to the silence that had once felt empty and now felt complete. He no longer paused at the door expecting something to come. He no longer listened for sounds that might break the quiet, because he understood that whatever had come to him had not been meant to stay. It had been meant to reveal, and once revealed, it did not need to return. The pendant remained on the table most days, sometimes in his pocket, sometimes resting where the light could touch it, but it no longer held the weight of a mystery. It had become something simpler, something steadier, a reminder that did not ask to be remembered, only to be lived. And as the weeks passed, the snow slowly gave way to patches of earth, the frozen ground softening under the slow work of the sun, the land shifting in small, quiet ways that marked the passing of time without needing to announce it. And Elias watched those changes the same way he now watched. Everything, not searching, not questioning, just seeing, letting each moment exist as it was, because he had come to understand that not every change needed to be measured, some simply needed to be noticed. And one morning, as he stood on the porch with the early light stretching across the land, he realized something that settled into him with a quiet certainty. He could no longer remember the exact sound of her voice, not clearly, not in the way he might repeat it, and for a brief second, that felt like loss, like something slipping away, but then it passed, because he understood that the voice had never been the point, the words had never been the thing that mattered. It had been the choice, the moment, the opening of the door, and that did not fade, that did not disappear. With time, it remained in the way he now stood, the way he now moved through the world without the weight he had carried before. And as the wind moved gently across the open ground, carrying the scent of thawing earth and distant water, Elias Crow stepped down from the porch and walked out into the land once more, not because he needed to, not because he expected anything, but because it felt right, his boots pressing into the softening ground, leaving marks that would last only a short while, before fading. And he did not look back at them, did not measure their depth or direction, because he knew now that the path a man walked did not need to be preserved to have meaning. It only needed to be chosen. And as he reached the same place where the circle had once been, now nothing more than open land, no marks, no signs, just space, He stopped, the wind brushing lightly against him, the sky stretching wide and clear above. And for a long moment he stood there, not waiting, not listening, just present. And in that stillness, there was no sense of being watched, no awareness of anything beyond what was already there. And yet it did not matter, because he knew, in a way that did not require proof, that the moment had already passed. The measure had already been taken, and it did not need to happen again. And as he turned back toward the cabin, the simple structure standing steady against the land, he felt no need to carry the past with him, no need to hold on to what had been, because it was already part of him, already shaping the way he lived without asking for attention. And as he stepped onto the porch and opened the door once more, the familiar warmth greeting him, the fire waiting, the quiet settled and whole, Elias Crow understood something that could not be spoken without losing its meaning. That out here, where the land did not care who a man was, where the wind did not remember his name, the only thing that truly remained was the kind of man he chose to be when no one was supposed to be there. And sometimes, without warning, someone was. And sometimes that was enough to change everything without changing anything at all.